Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archaeo Viking. Today, I'm joined by a fellow archaeologist and mutual of mine on social media, Archaeodeath, Professor Howard Williams, who's been on the channel a couple of times. And the subject of this video is sort of a continuation of the previous video in a sense. The previous video being a video on the Roman Empire being used as a propaganda tool for right wing extremism and white supremacy. Uh, and in this case, we're going to move a little bit forward in time and focus on the medieval period and certain myths of the medieval period
Hmm.
that have been used by right wing and white supremacist talking points as a whole. Now, some of it immediately is we're going to bring it up, but it's not going to necessarily be within Howard Williams' scope of expertise. For example, there's something that relates to the Crusades, which I believe is a little bit further out of his
Yeah,
expertise,
yeah.
but
You,
it's
you
still
can't
something
avoid
that,
it, but I'm
yeah.
it's not my bag,
No,
but yeah.
exactly. It's not mine either. But it's still something that we can bring up
Yeah, yeah.
briefly.
Yeah, yeah,
So
absolutely.
so to start off, let's go off with the easiest myth, the myth of the idea of the Dark Ages. So Howard, why don't you go
Yeah.
into that? Well, so
Oh
why is
yes,
the idea of the
okay.
Dark Ages a myth?
Okay. So yes, I mean it I mean at one level it's like all myths they have evidential foundations and there's always
Mhm.
ways to justify them. So it's not a myth in the sense that it's inherently wrong. It's just that it's hardly ever used and it's never used in academic scholarship and for very, very good reasons.
Mhm.
And the idea that there was a time of Um, the darkness, it alludes to a number of overlapping things: lack of written sources, supposed decline and collapse of civilization, and
Mhm.
a a lack of enlightenment in spiritual and religious terms. And those kind of the idea of a dark ages, and there's many other facets to it, but the idea is that it's a time where either society collapses, goes backwards, goes into a time of regression, and darkness in spiritual, cultural, and
Mhm.
intellectual and technological terms. It's a time of backwardness. And when people this term is never really in living
Mhm.
memory or even in historical in mature modern historical and archaeological scholarship. It's never really been used without it being used tongue in cheek or as a
Mhm.
just a popular gloss on
Yeah.
a way to introduce a book, to get a bit of a catchy headline. But no historian or archaeologist has ever used it in a fully serious, in even a book with a title like that, it would
Mhm.
then be qualified. It does have some areas where it has been used by scholars, um, in very specific times where it's kind of better than a worse option, you know. And so you do see it surfacing over the last 80, 90 years occasionally. Like there was a few edited books on early medieval Scotland, on the 5th to 11th centuries in Scotland,
Mhm.
where Scotland as a nation obviously is born at the very end of that period, and talking about Scotland is itself an anachronism, just like England and Wales are anachronisms in that period. And so some scholars at various points have called it Dark Age to get around other garbage terms like early historical. What does that mean? No one knows
Yeah.
what that means.
Yeah.
Or early Christian, which has obviously, by definition, religious
Mhm.
baggage with it, or indeed doesn't doesn't represent and reflect the many cultural and linguistic overlaps in Scotland at that time, including Brythonic speakers, Gaelic speakers, or ancestral Gaelic speakers, it's Old Irish speakers,
Mhm.
um, um, Greek and Latin speakers, Norse speakers, and of course throughout the period, Old English speakers, Anglo-Saxon speakers. And so, Dark Age is a shite term. It's a rubbish term, but I'm just giving you an example of
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
it has been occasionally used as a shorthand to get around a long waffle of all
Yeah.
of the terms. So when scholars, particularly medievalists, who are very emphatic about how the Dark Ages is utterly evil and useless term, I agree, but we always, like all these terms, there's always examples where scholars have used it as a way out of a problem just to get
Mhm.
across an idea, and then they go, and here's all the problems with it. And of course I'm not saying this, and I'm not saying that. So like all these labels, it's a nightmare, it's a curse upon all our houses, but
Mhm.
sometimes you've seen scholars use it. But the reason why it doesn't exist is a lot of the a lot of the areas that are dark in terms of little written sources now have vast amounts of archaeological evidence. So they're not
Mhm.
dark at all. We know we can see this cliche of
Mhm.
we've shed light on the Dark Ages. Yeah, we've been doing that for 100 years, but it's a cliche of the media. There's no period where we have absolutely no evidence. Yes, there are
Yeah.
areas where the archaeological record is poorer, and there's very few written texts that were produced that survive. But that doesn't mean people weren't writing stuff down.
Yeah.
So the idea of a cultural linguistic, black hole, a dead zone, a disaster, a Mad Max, a post-apocalyptic scenario in the early Middle Ages, in late antiquity, in the early Middle Ages, has long been dismissed. So, and of course, it's incredibly Occidental. It's very Western European bias because in many parts of the Arab world and elsewhere in Central and South Asia, these
And
centuries were
yeah.
times of cultural,
Yeah.
uh, an explosion of cultural and
Yeah.
technological and scientific advances. So it only makes sense for a very small part of a, a small part of the Eurasian continent.
Yeah.
And so there's
Yeah.
all those Western European white supremacist biases that come with it.
Yeah.
So it's a term we don't use seriously. There's been a few little like moments where it's been used. I mean, I've used it tongue in cheek, obviously, and still had people go, "You can't talk about the Dark Ages." I say, "I know." That's why literally the book title says "Digging into the Dark Ages," and it's about public archaeology, about the terms we use,
Yeah.
and we were engaging with that very problem of this is a term that everyone understands roughly, or it's something to do with the end of Rome and what came after, but no one knows
Mhm.
when it was. Is it the fifth to the 15th century? Is it just the fifth and sixth centuries?
Mhm.
So my point is, there has been some occasions where it's used. The places where it's been used, where I've defended it, and I got into a little bit of a spat with medievalists, is on a specific heritage site in the southwest of Britain called
Mhm.
Tintagel, where over a decade ago, the new heritage interpretation put up on the site
Mhm.
decided on that site alone to use the term Dark Age. And the reason they did that, Dame, and it was a good justification. I joined in the criticisms of them choosing it because I thought
Mhm.
it's a shite term. But I
Mhm.
saw why they used it. And a lot of scholars went on a social media rant
Mhm.
about how it's outrageous they use the term Dark Ages when actually they had good reason to, Dane, because this is a site, a rare site where we have a late antique or early medieval phase of fifth to seventh centuries, right?
Mhm.
And then we have a massive medieval castle dumped on top of it. And so
Yeah.
using the term if as a visitor, if you said, "Oh, that's the early medieval site," and there's the medieval site,
Mhm.
the visitor's going to go and people. And the problem is in Britain, we've got this curse that early medieval, in historical terms, even until recently, historians have used early medieval differently from archaeologists, and they've
Mhm.
used it for the Norman period. So this
Uh,
the
yeah.
earliest phases of the castles at the very end of the early medieval period, you know so we have this mess of terms. So the heritage people, when this is English heritage site, decided, I tell you what we're going to do, we're going to put all the signs and call the fifth
Mhm.
to seventh centuries Dark Age, just so that it's clear to visitors that's completely different. That's the early medieval fortress and
Mhm.
trading site where we've got evidence of imported Mediterranean amphora and tableware. This is they're trading tin right the way along the west
Mhm.
coast and into right the way to Byzantium, to the Eastern Roman Empire. It's really important that people
Mhm.
understand that is different from the castle built by Earl Richard, Duke of Cornwall, in the 13th century,
Yeah.
inspired by Arthurian associations with the site. He built the castle to because the
Oh.
site was connected to Arthurian legend
That's
in the
funny.
13th
Yeah.
century. So
Yeah.
so you can see this is a nest of nightmare because there's the Arthurian myths about Tintagel, there's the
Mhm.
Dark Age site, and then there's the late medieval castle. And so, yes, a lot of scholars went absolutely lost their their tiny minds over the choice of the heritage site to use the term Dark Age. I criticised it too. Don't get me wrong. I wasn't saying, "Oh no, it's all right." And no, it's really not. It's really not. But I understood why they tried to use that
Yeah.
term, um, to try and give the visitor at that specific site some differentiation between very different phases of the archaeological site. And I just use that as an example to show you that like all of these terms, they're messy, they're
Yeah.
awful, they get full of baggage, and it's not just passive or loaded terms. It's a bit confusing. I mean, loaded as in they bring with them baggage and narratives that are deeply,
Hmm.
wrong, misleading, and sometimes, harmful and pernicious. And particularly for Cornwall, which is a Celtic nation, is often it's been subject to a sort of long sort of trickle of colonialism, not sort of
Yeah.
a colonialism like in the it's say in what is now the United States or elsewhere, but a trickle of English and an
Yeah.
ongoing socio-economic and cultural distinctive, the destruction of the Cornish language and so on. This
Mm.
really smarts for Cornish people to have that derogatory connection to the Dark Ages, giving this idea that one of their greatest archaeological sites is a time of primitivism and backwardness. And
Hmm.
you can see why that gets under their skin,
Yeah, of
again.
course.
So
Yeah.
I'm not ignoring the problems with it. And it's some of those things where, I'd never go to an academic conference and without massive scare quotes talk about the Dark Ages unless I was deliberately trying to annoy someone, which has been known. But my point
Yeah.
is, and the term Dark Ages therefore is full of this idea that we can debunk on so many levels. And then there's a bigger fundamental level of how we define all societies. And Dane, from your perspective, you know this. We've moved away from terms to talk about savagery, primitive,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
barbarian, these loaded, and Dark Ages is part of that. Look, some societies are enlightened, civilized, cultural. We
Hmm.
can see them as us, earlier foreshadowings of us, whereas other societies are, oh, they were violent, they were backward, they
Hmm.
were fragmentary, constant endemic warfare, as if we're not in endemic warfare. This these kind,
Yeah.
and so there's that grand global issue of when we see the collapse of complex systems of trade and exchange and hierarchy, it doesn't mean we're dealing with a dark age. You might be looking at some times where for most people, suddenly life was a little bit easier, or at least for some people. I'm not saying it was all
No,
roses and
yeah.
but it's we're putting value. It's a value judgment term, and it's our value judgments, and I suppose that's the bottom line of why it's so rubbish.
Yeah.
So that was a rant, but I hope that helps
Yeah.
capture what
Oh
you
yeah.
know.
Well, and exactly. And I think a sort of an extension of that is like for example the air quotes Viking Age, which most of the time people are like, "Oh, the Viking Age was, 793 to
Yeah,
1066 when, Stamford Bridge and when also when William the Conqueror, conquered England. But that's also not the whole picture because and as you have and I've both gone over in different videos, like okay, well, like like one thing I like to point out is like okay, but we have like records from, for example, Gregory of Tours, who was a French scribe, a Frankish scribe during the Merovingian period of France, who was writing about Danish raiders raiding the Frankish coast. It's like okay, that's technically you could argue in the 500s you could argue that's the beginning of the Viking Age. And you could argue not because it wasn't as widespread as after Lindisfarne, but what's our metric here? And then also it's like, oh, 1066 is the end. It's like, okay, but you know the the Scandinavians were still using similar tactics against the various peoples of the Baltic coast in the Northern Crusades well into the 1300s. So it's like
the, the,
again,
the,
yeah,
the periodization nightmare that we're
yeah,
all working with periods that don't
yeah,
work.
yeah,
And particularly if we give them ethnic names and ethnic
yeah,
labels or baggage. And Vikings and Viking Age is a term that archaeologists can't shake off, no matter how
yeah.
much we go. And we have every generation is hand wringing about it. Oh, it's a bit wrong. Oh, we've got to do
Um,
something about the Viking term. But at the end of the day, if you want to tell anyone about the early Middle Ages, you've got to somehow use Viking
yeah,
as your channel does itself. It's got
yeah,
it's a way in. It doesn't mean you're only dealing with that, and
yeah,
we unpack
exactly.
those connotations. But yes, it's very similar, and the Viking phenomenon, the Viking world, the Vikings,
Yeah.
is an absolute blight. I mean, I'm just examining a doctoral thesis, which I'm going to Sweden in 2 weeks to examine, and it has. I won't waft it at you, but
Yeah,
because I
of
don't
course,
want
yeah.
to. But it actually, well, it's already published. You see, so it's a different system in Sweden. But it's they
Okay.
it they the whole of the study is about the Merovingian slash Vendel period, because
Yeah.
in Sweden it's called the Vendel period. It's a very weird
Yeah.
nationalist term,
Yeah.
and then the Viking Age comes after that, and they just call it the Late Iron Age. And like hardly in the most of the book, most of the entire thesis, I'm just looking for the term Viking Age is defined as a period of time only in traditional archaeological, typological,
Yeah. Yeah.
chronological, typochronological definition, circa 750 to 1100, broadest. And then that's it. The Vikings and Vikingness and it hardly appears as a meaningful term throughout
Hmm.
the entire academic study. And that's exactly the limits of how we should use it. Use it as little as possible in chronological terms and
Hmm.
move on.
Yeah. Like, another caveat you could use is, like, for example, like, okay, well, what about, before Stamford Bridge and Norman the Norman invasion and such. You can argue, like, well, could you count the rise of the, and I know this is not a completely accurate term, so I'm going to use air quotes, but the rise of the North Sea Empire
Mm,
under the Danish kingdom, where arguably Canute the Great begins, when he, sort of, kind of, maybe, sort, not quite, completely unifies all of Scandinavia and Northern Europe and such under his rule, and you can sort of see a more and even really under his father Swin Forkbeard and his grandfather Harold Bluetooth, you can sort of see a trend towards professionalization of the military. Not complete professionalization, but you can see more and more people that's sort of all they do is act as warriors, like the Jomsvikings, who, whether or not they actually existed, the idea is that the idea I always argue is they were sort of a mercenary group, and mercenaries are absolutely professional soldiers. Again, whether or not they actually existed is up for debate, but that in itself is still different from just sporadic raiding and trading during the Viking Age. So, again, going back to this, like, where do we end these time periods?
yeah.
And
I mean, and
unfortunately, uh, uh,
oh,
unfortunately, that's where part of where white supremacy comes in, is they love these concrete
they're like
time
sound
periods.
bites.
Yeah, sound bites and
They
time
don't care about
periods.
the
Yeah,
detail.
yeah,
That's
exactly.
the problem with extremists is that they're latch onto terms and labels, and that
Hmm.
what you actually mean by them can be as ambiguous as you like. They don't care. So that's the
Yeah.
problem with trying to fact check morons and
Uh-huh.
hateful groups
Yeah.
is you can go, oh, I think that's the wrong term. Oh, you care about definitions. I had someone ranting at me today on social media about how, you know, oh, it's everything's everyone's wrong. And I said, yes, every term we use is screwed. That's why we have a conversation. I'll tell you a term, and this shows how utterly ignorant. I'm supposed to be an expert medievalist, but I
Yeah.
don't work with the Crusades. And I went to a conference recently, and a scholar gave a
Hmm.
keynote, one of the keynotes, and
Yeah.
this shows, and this is really honestly showing my ignorance because I've
Yeah.
seen this phrase, but I've
Yeah.
not thought about it. And there I was at a conference, I hadn't been reading about this period, but
Yeah.
a scholar talked about his study was about social memory in the Latin East.
Yeah.
And I was going, oh, what the fuck? What the hell's the Latin East? What do they mean by the Latin East? And of course, other people listening to this will go, of course, Howard, everyone knows what that is. But I honestly,
Yeah.
in that moment, either forgot, I
Yeah.
don't regularly work on it, and they
Yeah.
mean the popular term that we're trying to move away from is Crusader states. They mean the Latin,
Yeah.
the states established in the Eastern Mediterranean Levant that we traditionally call the Crusader states. But that term is so freighted with, um, you know, or Western civilization, holy war rhetoric,
Yeah.
that scholarship prefers to talk about the Latin East for Edessa, Tripoli, Antioch, Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem, because it's about they're trying to emphasize that these are ethnically mixed. You
Hmm.
know, Latin is and the church is the common glue. It has problems with it in itself, but my point is that's what he was trying to mean. But I'm sorry, for most popular uses, if you don't talk about the Crusaders and
Yeah.
then unpack what that means, people aren't
Yeah.
going to know what you're talking about. And I confess, I'm not trying to criticize a scholar. He's talking to a very expert audience, as an expert, why
Yeah.
should he try and use populist terms? But for me, I was going, what? Where's the Latin East? Is it east of what? East Anglia, East Baltic,
Yeah.
East India, East Asia. East of what? East Hawaii.
Yeah.
Where could it be east of? And I thought, oh, no, sorry, let east as in medieval.
Yeah.
And I was just like felt a bit embarrassed, but I didn't tell anyone. I just sat there being a dumbass for 5 minutes, going, oh, what's he talking about? Oh, social
Yeah.
memory within the states of how they remember how they were founded and and it was really good paper. But I was just floundering for a few minutes. So I'm just sharing that honest
Yeah.
ignorance because
Yeah.
we all struggle with specialist terms and we're all sort of going, oh, yeah. And there's terms that I've used for decades and I've realized I've been slightly using them differently from other people, and I'd
Yeah.
never really thought about it. I went, oh, because I've been using it as an archaeologist for this material,
Yeah.
I've never had to challenge myself to think about how other people are using it ever so slightly differently.
Yeah.
Oh well,
E-
it's a
ex-
mess.
Exactly. Well, and then you mentioned the Crusades. I guess that, leads into can help us lead into a very brief discussion of something you brought up on your TikTok. It's like the current head of the Department of Defense
Oh my God, yeah.
in my nation, the United States, Pete Hegseth, who has a Crusader, tattoo, like Crusader cross tattoo on his chest. And unfortunately, that's which is part of why I've decided to do this video. Is unfortunately the connection to the Crusades and everything and knights has been a common white supremacist uh, tool in the United States since the
Yeah.
beginning. For example, after the Civil War, a bunch of the
Okay.
American Civil War, because that's something I like to make the caveat, because of course there are multiple different Civil Wars, but the American Civil War, um,
Yeah.
a lot of Southern former Confederate soldiers would form like secret, not quite the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, but similar groups to that, and a lot of them would be things like, oh, the Knights of Golden Columbus, or the Knights of this, the Knights of that.
Hmm.
Some even still go
Yeah.
by that, and so it's and I think that's something
Yeah.
you
I mean,
sort of alluded to with Pete Hegseth.
this is the scary thing about
Yeah,
how absolutely grossly ignorant you've got to be.
yeah,
Not looking at you. I mean,
yeah. Obviously,
one
yeah,
has
yeah,
to be to.
yeah,
It doesn't matter what happened in the Middle Ages. It
yeah.
doesn't matter how this symbol was used in the 19th
Yep.
century. All you have to do is to look back a generation to see
Hmm.
how these symbols use and to say, okay, well, we can study that academic period. We can talk rhetorically maybe about fighting for rights and to talk about
Yeah.
fighting or crusading, as long as you're careful about using it. There's so many all existing negative connotations with crusading as someone who's lost the plot, lost any reason, is just on a crusade. There's
Yeah.
so many derogatory associations with that. And there's so much history there within your own nation
Yeah.
that all you need to do is have literally a kindergarten level of understanding to realize how dangerous and simple,
Yeah.
overtly, um, overtly dangerous this is. It doesn't
Yeah.
mean that everyone who plays a
Yeah.
video game of medieval knights or anyone who does cosplay or
Yeah.
anyone who goes to a castle for a holiday in Europe is some kind of extremist. But if you're overtly using it in a political
Yep.
context to evoke holy war against enemies of your Christian faith, metaphorically and physically with firearms, and you are literally on your body daubing yourself with 1776 and
Yeah.
associated American War Revolutionary War symbolism merging with Deus Vult as a symbol, which is a
Yeah.
accurate. It is accurate. It is a Crusader symbol. See, it's
Yeah.
not about debunking it. It actually
Yeah. Of
is.
course.
They've
Yeah.
got a. It's a twisted understanding of the Crusades. It's a
Yeah.
simplified understanding of the Crusades, but at least in part, the Crusades were, as these extremists think they were, a military religiously driven war against non-Christians, to the decimation of not simply Muslims but Jews and Christians that you just don't like and don't practice, the Orthodox Christians. So at least in part,
Hmm.
this is overt. It doesn't matter what happened in the Middle Ages. This is about the far right in the Christian nationalist far right in America. And for people, when I did this video and I just said
Yeah.
Cross of Jerusalem, Crusader symbol, doesn't mean that everyone who uses it is
No,
is
yeah.
is using it, but in that context with his other tattoos, and the guy's written a book.
Yeah.
He actually he did a try to do a pre-bunk. He tried to put out media to mitigate the narrative, control the narrative. He
Yeah.
fed it, he clearly fed it. I haven't got proof of that, but it's quite clear. It was like Peter Hayser talks about his tattoos. He wasn't allowed to, I can't remember the details. He wasn't allowed to be on a contingent of National Guard serving for Biden's inauguration because of his tats.
Yeah.
So it's not as if it was suddenly all these liberal snowflakes going, oh, he's got some kind of scary tattoos. The military themselves saw them as beyond the pale, beyond what they consider tolerable symbols. They are on the lookout themselves. The US military are on the lookout for these hate symbols on their soldiers because they can't have soldiers go off on one, because
Yeah.
and so when I thought that was all well known, that was all documented. This isn't my making it up. This is me just looking at the basic media in your country and going,
Yeah.
what the heck? And people are going, oh no, and so it's illegal to be Christian now. And it's not about being Christian. It's
No,
about
yeah.
being having an overt political ideology that is about likening America to the Crusades. And that should
Yeah.
terrify all Christians as much as it should terrify all
Yeah.
Muslims in America and all Jews in America and all atheists in America and all anything else, indigenous people. It should terrify anyone who uses their religion in such a politicized militaristic way. And I just can't believe that that hasn't disqualified someone from one of the highest, most powerful positions in charge of the military of one of the most powerful nations in the world. But what do I know?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So so yeah,
Sorry, a bit of a rant again, Dane, but I hope
no, it's
that's okay.
okay.
I'm not an expert in American politics, and I hope your
No,
audience
no.
appreciate that. But I mean, I was just commenting on it because it was such an explicit, obvious
Yeah.
issue that this is it's not as if he's accidentally did a
Hmm.
Roman salute and oh
Oh
no, it's a Roman
yeah.
salute. I mean, that's if that's bad enough, but this is daubing something permanently on your body that aligns you to a political ideology that links church and state, and not just every church but a very particular brand of evangelical far right
Yeah.
Christian nationalism. So
Yeah.
it's scary
Exactly.
times, and I feel sorry for a lot of people in the
All right, so that's it's all very good points about the Crusades, and unfortunately, like as you put it, it doesn't matter what happened in the past. It matters how it's been used.
yeah.
Arguably, again, like I how it's been used since the mid 1800s, because it's just
Yeah.
that's how it's continued. And also, if you want to think about it, even though it's more benign, it's connected to, in a lot of ways, to like, for example, Oak Island, on the Oak Island documentary series on the History Channel, where it's all like, oh, the Knights Templar escaped Europe and they came here and they built this. Oh, what's that? Native Americans were in the area? No, forget about them. It was the Knights Templar. It can't possibly be that. And I say that because stuff like that is heavily absorbed by, you know, people who are, right wing and Republican and, everything. They love,
But it's But
stuff
it's
like that.
but the Middle Ages is a
Yeah.
fantasy ground for
You,
slogans, symbols,
yep.
slogans, tropes that feed into what Echo would call fascism. It's
Yeah.
the fear of difference.
Hmm.
It's the contempt for it's a machismo.
Yeah. Hmm.
It's about a contempt for the weak and it's about purity. It's about
Yeah.
ancestry. It's about militarism. It's about power. It's about um and this fear of the other. And
Yeah.
that's I think one of the key things that all this is about is this rejection of modernism, this uh,
Hmm.
a desire for a past that never was to produce a future that may never be, but you can hope that somewhere, someplace, you'll have your promised land of white
Yeah.
only.
Yeah.
1950s America merges with the Middle Ages, merges with bits of ancient Sparta and Rome, merges with
Yeah.
some fantasy, paleo diet nonsense and eco,
Yeah.
Garden of Eden,
Hmm.
bull crap. And so it's not. They're not yearning for any one moment.
No.
They're using slogans and tropes. It's about insulting almost every period of the past, and that's why we can't really fact check it, because there's nothing to fact check.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's it's taking horrible, twisted bits of everything,
Yeah.
mashing it together, and expecting people to suck it up rather than challenge it.
Yeah. Well, exactly. Well, and going on the machismo, one of the big, I would argue the biggest example of where the machismo comes from is things like going back to the Vikings, the idea of these invincible, unstoppable, warriors who, maybe sometimes berserkers are thrown in there, and they're these, peak, evident,
Mm,
signs of manliness that so many people love to so many people in that group love to emulate, along with Rome, Sparta, etc.
mm,
And also the idea connected to that, the idea an idea that you have yourself have combated against before, the idea that, oh, they were this pure, solely white Scandinavian group, ignoring that they, they went into Central Asia, they went into the Middle East, all
mm,
kinds of things. Of course, they went to North America and such. Well, and then also by proxy, something that you and I both addressed recently, that they were the first people, air quotes, to be in Greenland and certain parts of North America, which of course is not true at all.
No, no,
Yeah,
you did a great video on that, didn't
yeah,
you, Dane? And
yeah,
because I was just did it very quickly, and you went into real depth into the prehistoric archaeology of
yep,
the North Atlantic and the
exactly.
High
Yeah,
Arctic, and that's really important because people don't know this stuff.
yeah,
And what's really important, I think, is that it's we're getting to this fact checking left and right, and when if it's sad where actually not a made majority, but a disturbing minority of my videos are
yeah,
fact checking people
yeah,
trying to dump on Trump, which is so easy. But in so doing, they're leaving open some really other
yeah.
pernicious narratives. When I
Hmm.
see heritage sites jumping on the bandwagon of mocking Trump, but in so doing, celebrating Nordic militarism at a time
Yeah,
when, literally Russia's breathing down the neck
yeah.
of Finland and the Baltic states. It's not a good time to start being silly about these matters.
Well, yeah,
And I've had a
yeah,
go at Brits as well about this, talking about,
yeah.
oh, we'll have civil war in this country. Last summer, we had nutters on the streets of Britain trying to
Hmm.
burn asylum seekers in their hotels. There's not a
Yeah,
time to make jokes about civil war in England too, or Britain more
yeah,
broadly. So I'm a bit of a misery, and I have a go at everyone online because I'm not, I don't always have the right answers, but I just see the connections. I'm trying to say, are we really doing that now when we've
yeah.
got all these wars going on and all these internal cultural conflicts? We've got to be so careful with how people run with our narratives. I mean, often they're done in good. I mean, it's so frustrating having to
Yeah.
push back against some of this nonsense from your country's government, for example, trying to say
Yeah.
we want Greenland,
Oh
but then
yeah, yeah.
you don't react to that by going, it's always been Danish. It's been
No.
Danish for 1,000 years. Like, Danes, your colonizers,
Yeah,
you and your colony failed, and it wasn't your colony because then anyway,
yeah.
it's complicated,
Well,
and so
yeah,
we need to know that
yeah.
story. Yeah,
Well, and like you mentioned, the colonizers thing, because that's something that a couple years back, some people, and I understand why they did it, but they were, when they were trying to claim, oh, the Vikings didn't, medieval Scandinavians didn't colonize. And again, I get why what they were getting at is they were saying, well, their colonization was not the same as, the
yeah,
colonization of the 16th through
yeah,
the 20th century, and that's fair.
yes,
And by the way, of course, in the 16th and 20th, from the 16th to 20th century, it wasn't just Europeans doing it. Imperial China and Imperial Japan
of course.
also committed. There's you can look this up later, but there's this event during the rise of Imperial China. called the Zungar genocide, where a group of Mongols rebelled against the Imperial China, and the Chinese emperor ordered all of them exterminated, and all their children, married into families, and so that
Yeah.
they, yeah. But anyways, but like the point is, like, yeah, that's Viking colonization wasn't the same as that.
No.
However, my whole point was like, but we can't say that they didn't colonize,
No.
especially in the case of like the as Ben Raffield has said, and though I agree with your statements that Ben Raffield should have qualified what he meant in his papers on the Great Heathen Army,
Yeah.
and its colonization, but he still had a good point. It's like that this was a massive settling force. It wasn't just an army; it was entire families that were coming
Absolutely.
in and taking entire swaths of land. The Rus went into Central Asia and brutally subjugated the Khazar Turks and some of the Bulgar Turks, and then actually forcibly converted the Khazar Turks from Judaism to Christianity, which is sounds very familiar to what happened in the United States and in many parts of the British and other European empires. And then, of course, the North Sea Empire, when Knut the Great went into England and executed most of the Anglo-Saxon nobility and replaced it with his own people. All that could, in a lot of ways, and of course the Sami and such, in a lot of ways, could be seen as a form of colonialism. Again, not to the same degree as
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, as colonialism from the Age of Empires, but I think that to ignore that fact also plays into the idea of, in my opinion, it overlooks the actions of um, certain actors in the medieval period.
It depends on where you're having the conversation and whether you've
Yeah,
defined your terms, because I think this is
yeah,
the issue, isn't it? Is
yeah,
one of the laziest and most ignorant, anti-historical, ahistorical pushbacks I've seen online is people are saying, well, everyone's colonized, so it's
yeah.
okay,
No,
isn't it? So
yeah,
likening the 19th century
yeah.
settlement of the Midwest and
Oh yeah,
of what is now the United States, well, it was then the United States. So I'm
yeah,
just getting don't want to be I'm trying to overcorrect myself there, but
yeah. Of course, yeah,
equating that with
yeah,
say
yeah,
the Norse settlement of the Outer Hebrides and or the arrival of a particular snake species in on a particular island,
yeah,
and
yeah,
the connotations are easily used one way to justify, oh well, this is just a natural part of being human
yeah.
as we
I agree.
kill,
Yeah,
murder, and then the flip side is, no, we shouldn't deny that,
yeah,
as you rightly say about
yeah.
these periods of the past, there was great upheaval, great dislocation, and colonization has always been on a spectrum of scales, intensities, and
Mm-hmm.
strategies. And it's not about denying
Yeah.
that you're trying to say, oh, in the same with questions like enslavement. Yes, it's not about saying that there was never
Mm-hmm.
enslavement of peoples around the world before the transatlantic slave trade, but it's also recognizing the distinctiveness. In the same way, people will use the uniqueness of the Holocaust to make a particular extremist argument.
Mm-hmm.
Also, people have used the, oh, Holocaust is just one of many genocides to make a specific political argument. And it's about being aware of both extremes, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Simultaneously, to avoid falling into the pitfalls of um, various extremist appropriations of these narratives, because we're always, whatever we say, we're always one step away from someone taking our words and running with them. And I think that's where I feel, we're always, everything we say, every YouTube video we make,
Mm-hmm.
someone could soundbite it, cut a bit out,
Oh,
and
I'm
suddenly
sure.
I'm
Yeah.
I'm I'm an advocate for X, Y, and Z. But we can't help that. But what we can do is stay true to
Yeah.
the nuance without denying the themes. Yeah, so archaeologists would tend to see colonialism as a deep time phenomenon that starts sometime in prehistory, can be addressed for in a variety of different contexts
Mm-hmm.
throughout the ancient worlds of the Mediterranean and Southwest Asia, right the way up to the present day. But equally, we wouldn't pretend that
Yeah.
the terra nullius of situation in Australia, where the wholesale genocide of Aboriginal peoples by
Mm-hmm.
British authorities, you know, was a normal thing.
Yeah.
That was
Oh,
literally. There's never been a moment like that in the past where a whole subcontinent has been transformed.
sorry, my camera acting up for just one. There we go.
Oh,
That it was just I noticed the thing, but yeah, exactly. Well, and talking about the Holocaust, and and this is something that unfortunately a lot, and this is not something that I should preface this. This is not something that people who specialize in the rise of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust do. But like the idea that it was unique because what it and this is and I learned this from experts in the of the Holocaust and the rise of Nazi Germany and I'm going to talk about my home country for a second because the Nazi Germany got the idea for the concentration camps and death camps and their idea of Lebensraum, their expansion into Eastern Europe, from the United States and from its policies of genocide and cultural assimilation of the Native Americans. Like
But it's so
that's
important, isn't it? That's such
yeah,
an important point because
yeah,
people want to bracket off bad
yeah,
guys
yeah,
and not realize that there are the British, the Americans, and many other European nations, the
yeah,
French colonialism, the
yeah,
Dutch, all provide. I'm not saying these particular. I'm just saying all of the
yeah,
European
yeah,
nations, to different degrees, provided templates,
yeah,
narratives, discourses that.
yeah,
So when it's like
exactly.
when people say about, oh, the Nazis stole our sacred German symbols, and I'm going, hang on, you mean the ones that were literally made up by
Yeah,
esoteric,
yeah,
extremist nationalists in a decade before? We've got
yeah,
to understand there's deeper roots, the 19th century and immediate roots, and then deeper time
yeah,
roots to what happened in those horrible years,
yeah,
those dark moments. And yes, it's not taking anything away from the terror and horror to
yeah.
say that, yeah, they got these ideas from America, or they got these ideas,
Yeah.
they were obsessed with Native Americans and
Hmm.
cosplaying them, and
And
this is
they
all part of
still
the
are.
story. Yeah,
Yeah. And they still are from a friend of mine actually when he was getting his master's he studied abroad in Germany and he's just like oh yeah there's still cosplaying as Native Americans there and I've talked with other Native American like actual Native American individuals who've been like yeah no that's it's a real bad thing in Germany and like Scandinavia and such people dressing up white people dressing up as Native Americans and stereotypical Native Americans I might add unfortunately so yeah they are still obsessed with that very much.
that's weird. Okay, yeah,
Yeah,
I mean that's something I didn't know, that I didn't realize that was still a thing. But
yeah,
what is scary is that
yeah.
it's Germany is always was not suddenly exposed to American culture in the 1950s and 60s
No,
post-war. It
no.
was already deeply obsessed
Mhm.
with American frontier culture and
Yeah,
settler models, and
yeah.
the East. Yeah, that's it's a really weird and
Hmm.
easily overlooked parallel. Yeah,
Yeah. Well, and this is something I only learned
dialogue.
recently. Yeah. Well, yeah, but this is something I only learned recently, but apparently during the American Civil War, and it's not just Germany, but apparently a lot of military officials from Germany, France, and Britain and such actually went and observed some of the battles and sort of thought that America was bad at war, but they then copied some of our technology. So it's kind of that's a kind of funny thing, little funny tidbit that not a lot of people know is that apparently they came and watched us fight our war and were like, "You guys are terrible at it." But
I I remember reading something about that a long while ago, so I won't
uh,
pretend to have known that.
yeah,
But I equally, yeah, that late 19th century period is just one long run up to the First World War. Where
yeah,
and it's after the Crimea conflict, and
yeah.
you think, my word, yeah, America was a good example of, oh, look, someone's fighting. Let's go and look. You know,
Yeah, exactly. Oh,
Mm.
look, they're well, because like like there was like there were boarding schools and residential schools. Boarding schools are what they were called in the U.S. Residential schools are what they were called in Canada, but where they would forcibly remove the children of Native American families. Okay, I can't say that. Sometimes they would actually willingly go, but it would still either way. It was a horrible experience when once they got there they would for any minor infraction would be brutally beaten and they would be starved and among any number of things and in fact they're still finding a lot of the children died at these institutions it's in the tens of thousands now combined with both the United States and Canada and they're still finding unmarked graves but it's not just that, there's the reservation system where they were all forcibly removed to plots of land and the worst plots of land they could find. And then um, there was like the extermination of their food sources. Like General Woom Tecumseh Sherman of Civil War fame, he and other generals gave the order for the U.S. Army to actually systematically hunt the American buffalo so as to starve Native Americans, and all
Yeah.
kinds of things. And they would perform experiments on Native American children and starve them to see how much nutrition they could actually required. Not In America we have the nutrition bars on the back of things. Actually, I think that's in Europe too. And I can't say for the ones in Europe, but in the US that's where we get our nutrition bars a lot. Also African American children. So yeah, and also the Jim Crow South was another example that the Nazis pulled from. So yeah, it's a yeah,
But
it's
how
a
can
deep time thing.
so? But it's going back to how the medieval past is being
Yeah,
used. Then it's kind of
yeah,
like it's like all our conversations about very recent
yeah,
history. We cannot deny the power of that distant past in
yeah.
people's narratives about who they are.
Hmm.
People want, for some people, the Vikings were yesterday, the Spartans were
Yeah,
last week, and they see that time jump. It's not in a, they don't see the time scientifically,
yeah.
and for them, their DNA results tell them that they are
Oh
X%
yeah,
Viking. So they have that somehow, that time, that DNA test is a time traveler. It allows you to jump from the distant past into the present. So one can be, not you, one
yeah. Of
can be
course,
a
yeah.
walking, talking ancestor, and they're playing with and misusing indigenous understandings of time and ancestry to do this. And that's one of the most insidious thing about it is they're obsessed with the European past that was white
Hmm.
only, and yet they're using very Native American spiritual ideas of personhood and ancestry to
Yeah,
make that connection. And that's why it's so doubly insidious. It's the
yeah.
cultural appropriation of indigenous spirituality
Hmm.
mixed with the European biological racialized obsession.
Yeah. Like talking about the appropriation of indigenous spirituality, and a thing that is has been superimposed onto the Viking Age and the Vikings, something that you have talked about at length, is the cultural appropriation of the chin line tattoos of the Native American peoples of
Oh
the
man.
Pacific Northwest and Alaska and Canada and such. And they're like, oh yeah, this is what they look like. And even though we have no archaeological evidence whatsoever, the closest archaeological evidence we have of tattoos is arguably not even tattoos, is, Ibn Fadlan's, oh, they darkened their eyes. And it's like, okay, well, was that tattoos? Was that eyeliner? Like,
Yeah.
and like, was it a metaphor? Because, you could argue
Yeah.
darkening their eyes was like, they would become serious or whatever. There's really no way of knowing what he meant in that context, but
Exactly,
either
Dane. And this is
way,
the problem, isn't it? Is that I don't want, I'm not here to police what t-shirts
yeah,
people wear, what
yeah,
shoes they wear, how they dress their hair, whether they have beards or
yeah,
not. I'm not here to, but I think it's really important to challenge people's claims to
yeah,
authenticity,
yeah,
which are often grossly misleading, including claims that there's evidence of Viking chin lines, and
yeah,
oh well, we know the Vikings did this. I think some Viking themed tattoos are really amazing, and they're really beautiful, and they're really inspiring if they
yeah,
link to people's faith and spirituality. I think it's great. What I'm talking about is I'm not having a go at that. I'm not challenging any of
yeah, of
that.
course,
What
yeah,
I am doing is um, pointing out that misuse of the past. If let's just make it up. Let's say that Custer's last stand, all of the Seventh Cavalry had chin lines, so it's
yeah.
true. People would go, "Well, what the hell are you talking about? There's no evidence for that." Yeah, but there may have been. There may have been time. Maybe the ones that didn't have their photographs taken. We have some photograph. Not everyone had their photograph. Maybe the rest of them had chin lines, and
Hmm.
people would just laugh,
Yeah,
absolutely laugh. But we've got to indulge this. Well, we don't have to, but
yeah, yeah,
there's this pressure on us to indulge this nonsense, and it's not to do with, I'm not saying don't wear this, don't wear that. Indigenous people are, and they're right to.
yeah.
I'm
It's
not.
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
pointing out this is false history, it's damaging false history because it's and the double angle is it's denigrating and valorizing the Vikings and other barbarian groups as some kind of noble savages,
Yep,
and that trope is coming from cultural appropriation of indigenous people. So it's
it is.
a double layered um toxic narrative.
Yeah,
It,
and
it demeans everyone.
yeah, yeah. But it's funny you mentioned them, like being portrayed as the noble savage and such. Because at a conference last year, a friend of mine who has a master's degree in early medieval history and such, he actually did a presentation about that where he was like, yeah, he's like, so when playing Indian fell out of favor, people started shifting to wearing fur and looking like Vikings from the TV show Vikings and things like that. And he's like, but that's not actually how the history,
No,
plays out. And he's like, that's a continuation of playing Indian, and so it's funny you mentioned that because that's exactly a point that is a lot of people have begun making is that it's primitivizing.
yeah,
It's making them seem you know like you said, like savage barbarians when
it's
in a lot of ways.
exoticizing,
Yeah,
fetishizing, there's all the isings,
yeah,
and it's also it's like it's imagining, and the Vikings are really interesting in this regard because I was talking about I was at a conference recently, we were talking about this very issue
yeah.
where it's a kind of nostalgia for a past that never was, but
Yeah.
some people want the past to be a time free of the modernity and escapism,
Hmm.
where we can immerse ourselves in a fantasy other, um, a retrotopia, as it's been described to me, where you are
Yeah.
going into an ideal world that was in the past. I don't think that's totally true because I think one of the other themes that people like about this noble savage trope is that there's salvation on the doorstep. That people who want to see tie it to a particularly naive and uncritical pagan spirituality can latch onto it, but so can Christians, because the idea is they are the noble savages who made good.
Yeah.
And there's the narrative arc of well, it's like a bad Hollywood movie where the guy does all the retributive bad stuff and then goes, "No, I won't kill the last bad guy. I'll let him live and suffer with the guilt of your crimes. No, just
Uh,
kill him." And you go,
yeah.
"No, no, I won't." And you go, "Damn you!" And then they always attack, and he goes, "Oh, I had to kill you now."
Yeah.
But but the idea of no, I've learned from I know that's a dark path I shouldn't go down,
Yeah.
and like the Viking serves that purpose because the Viking can be a pagan and a Christian, but most importantly can be a convert. They can see the light,
Hmm.
and so there's something really eerily evangelical about Vikings as well.
Yeah.
That while some people can wallow in their paganness and their otherness, other people can wallow in their um salvational, is that a word? Salvate that
Yeah.
they can be redemptive. That's what I was
They're
thinking of.
yeah,
That
they're
they're
redemptive. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Or
You can be all those bad things, but then you can come good and
yeah.
save the. You can be the Arnold Schwarzenegger Terminator, but then you can save a small child or something like that, and it's
Yeah.
okay. Then you're a good psycho murdering robot, you know,
Yeah.
or whatever it may be. You know, there's that.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, and I think that people love that bittersweet arc narrative of the Vikings, and they come out of darkness into the Enlightenment of the Christian Middle Ages, which is just utter bollocks. But you know, it's something people love the idea of. You know that.
Yeah.
Um, so there's it's a lot. The thing is, Vikings are and other barbarians from early medieval Europe. The time of nations' origins is a time where people can latch many tropes onto, just as the American West can have. You can have your Native Americans, you can have your
Mhm.
cowboys, you can have your Seventh Cavalry, you can have your
Yeah.
frontiersmen, and they can all somehow live at the same time. Somehow Davy Crockett was around. Yeah, over 150 years in the public imagination. I'm not saying in
Yeah.
reality.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
This shifts backwards and forwards, so we can have
Hmm.
this kind of golden age at some time in the 18 post American Civil
Yeah.
War, but it's also got all these other people from earlier and later, and it's all kind of
Hmm.
merged in, and John
Yeah.
Wayne's in it all, you know.
Yeah,
And
exactly. Yeah, yeah. Well, and also John Wayne somehow Genghis Khan.
absolutely,
I hate. Yeah. It,
could this be the son of God?
I never. A friend of mine and I did a reaction video that we had to it that like to that movie that we had intended to upload on YouTube, but it was so horrible that we were just like, no, it's not worth it. But anyways, but yeah, well, like and going on the they can be pagan and Christian. Sort of continuation of that is the idea, and this is more towards pagans, and unfortunately within the neo-pagan community in the US, well, and in Europe also. There's they a lot of them lean heavily to the right, and there's this idea of, well, the idea that the Christians cut a bloody swath across Europe and forcibly converted everyone. And to be fair, that did happen to some degree. Like
Yes.
Charlemagne was particularly guilty of that. I mean, there's the bloody massacre of Verdun, but as you yourself have pointed out, a lot of times they, converted willingly, and a lot of times it was like, oh, I'm not going to trade with you unless you're Christian. Yeah, fine, whatever.
Yeah.
I'm Christian
Like,
now. Now give me
yeah,
my
like
money. Yeah,
Charlemagne wasn't
yeah,
like roving across the whole of thousands of miles,
yeah,
turning up at people's doorstep and
yeah,
saying, "You're a pagan, and now you die," in some
yeah,
kind of sort of, "No, it's Charlemagne again."
yeah,
Sort of, like,
yeah,
we've got to understand his, even though he was a Holy Roman Emperor and elected himself and had a geographical empire that was vast. On a European scale, in a North American scale, it's tiny, but I mean, on
yeah,
a
yeah,
European scale, it's still quite geographically
yeah.
restricted in his military aspirations and abilities. So, we have to be aware that there's stylized tropes from the early Middle Ages that suit a Christian origin
Hmm.
story of nations and civilization, as well as this kind of counterculture, edgy, noble savage traits. And so it's important for us as scholars to not lean into either of these. We don't have to take sides.
Yeah.
When we see competing, simplified, misleading, gross narratives, it's not about saying one's better than another. We should be just saying all of these have grains of, because the things that they all, that's the
Yeah.
seductive nature. They all have grains of truth into them. It's not about
Yeah.
they're wrong. It's about how we work with that to explain to people that, well, that's not exactly the way it was. So for
Yeah,
me,
exactly.
I mean, people always online, of course, being British, we're the worst of the worst, and everyone's like, yeah, you Brits, you did all these bad things. Of course we did, and I can be proud of being British, not because I'm denying those
Hmm.
things are
Yeah.
bad, but because it's not an either or. And
Yeah.
and people say, well, you're always trying to do down our history, you traitor, and all this kind of nonsense. No, this is what historians and archaeologists should be doing, is we should be
Yeah.
critically evaluating our sources and thinking about how those stories are used today. And if we're not doing that, if we're using terms that are just leading people into narratives, then we need to be correcting each other and reflecting on what we're doing. So it's not about,
Exactly.
there's no way we can be purists. There's no way we can escape the problems with our terms, our language, our narratives. All of these get used and misused. But what we can do is stay with the fight, stay with the arguments, keep people alert to the problems, get them engaged with the evidence. That the realities are more fun than the cozy simple fictions.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
given how passionate people are invested in the minutiae of the Star Wars universe and the Star Trek universe, and will have arguments over which bleeding lightsaber type is canon,
Hmm.
I know there's a thirst for that detail when we're dealing with the early Middle Ages. People do care about oval brooches. They do care about how long swords were and where they were manufacturing bows and arrows, and how their long ships actually were portaged across isthmuses.
Yeah.
And people care about all that detail. They don't just care about the tropes. Fascists just love the simple, noddy child history, with a few pictures and a few big words because they can't think of anything else. Not necessarily because they're intellectually backward, but because they choose to be seduced by simple stories. And that's a different point. And it's easy to mock people like Hegseth and say, oh, he's an idiot. He's not an idiot.
Yeah.
He's obviously a very intelligent guy. He has his obviously own his personal problems, which I've never talked about. But
Yeah.
they were issues for a person at highest to political office, but they were never things I talked about because I'm not in a position to make judgments about people's dependence on particular substances. That's not my issue. But what is an issue is that they choose to see the world in black and white and to foster
Hmm.
hate and extremist simple narratives. And they do it on their own. They ink it on their own bodies. They spat it with their unwashed hands on news channels. And they have the audacity to expect us to suck it up and to indulge it. And we shouldn't. We should just be going, this is garbage. And here's the
Hmm.
evidence of why it's garbage. And of course, they always say something that's vaguely on point, but that doesn't give them, a stop clock is correct twice a
Yeah.
day. That doesn't mean that
Yeah.
we don't criticize the when they get the time wrong the rest of the time.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and and I think that's all a very excellent point, and I think that sort of leads us into our last quick thing that I wanted to go over is the heavily connected in the U.S. The idea of like the Anglo-Saxon period and the
Oh yeah.
Anglo-Saxon heritage and such.
Mm.
Just real quickly
Oh yeah.
because it sort of goes back into everything else we've already said. But
Absolutely does.
but it's something that the U.S. as a heavily British and Irish and Scottish
Yeah.
descended country that a lot of white Americans are like, oh, our
Yeah.
Anglo-Saxon
Absolutely.
heritage, and
Whatever
so
that
like
means.
yeah, exactly. Well, that's
Yeah.
why I sort of wanted to go. It's like so. I think the best way to go over this is explain sort of the difficulties with the idea of like, for example, the Anglo-Saxon invasion.
Okay. Okay, so
Yeah,
yeah, so in can I go from the other end? Because I was just on the tip of my brain, but I will get to your point.
yeah,
Yeah, so baked into the American dream, the American model, the American Constitution is a model back to the founding fathers
yeah,
of going to a pre-Norman idyll of social structure. So the
yeah.
idea of an Anglo-Saxon past was influential, not exclusively, but it was part of the vision of America. And this became very much coded as white Northwestern Europeans
Hmm.
and even Irish people, of course, Scottish people, Welsh people were only slowly integrated into the idea of being white. Even Scandinavians weren't white.
Yeah.
Took a long time to be white. Now that's not something I'm an expert on, but my point
Of
is,
course,
in
yeah.
terms of modern perceptions of the term Anglo-Saxon, it's often a dog whistle. I've had medievalists say ridiculous rhetoric that every time you use the term Anglo-Saxon, it's a white supremacist dog whistle. That's a stupid thing to say, and I've seen grown ass academics say that, and that's just dumb. That's not the case. But in America, in the political, racialized context of 21st century American politics and culture, saying you're Anglo-Saxon or claiming Anglo-Saxon ancestry is heavily racialized, and
Yeah.
it's a dog whistle for white English in particular, and it's a claim to purity and the past. And so when we're dealing with that, then in academic terms, there's a
Hmm.
number of different problems, but the where it comes back to is this idea of where the English started. And the people in England hark back to this too. It's not simply an American problem. This
Yeah.
idea that the fifth century was a carte blanche, a change. Roman Empire collapsed, Britain as a province, raiders from Ireland and from Pictland
Yeah.
attacked the north and west, but it was the Saxons who took over. And the idea of a Saxon invasion or Saxon invasions, like a wave of military forces arriving on our shores, then to be themselves attacked by Vikings and Normans.
Yeah.
But the idea is that the Anglo-Saxon moment is an Anglo-Saxon origins built on land claims and colonialism was a beautiful model, a seductive model, a divinely sanctioned model for
Yeah.
America. I'm not saying everyone saw it exactly this way, but this is a seductive idea of coming to a new land, forging a new world, forging a new society. And so that's the power, particularly from an American perspective, as I understand it, of the Anglo-Saxon origin myth, the idea of peoples coming, fleeing persecution, fleeing conflict,
Hmm.
fleeing other crises, coming to these shores, finding it unoccupied apart from all the people that were there.
Yeah.
And liberating them of the land they didn't have because they weren't there, apart from the fact they were, and
Yeah.
and forging a new society. And some of these models, like the American model, are a melting pot myth as well. That yeah, the British did survive, but they just integrated peacefully into as
Mhm.
benign. They saw the betterment of Anglo-Saxon ways, and this is baked into the origins of history and archaeology of the period. The writers of the mid 19th century who set the foundations for Anglo-Saxon archaeology and history very much wrote about this in this way. This is about a immigrants, Germanic immigrants, part of a broader pan-Germanic or Teutonic family who
Yeah.
founded England took the best of the Roman ways, took the best of the British ways, and forged a new world that was inevitably justified British military and colonial expansionism, Christian missionizing around the world. And that it was our Englishness that made us superior and made us forge multiple empires. And of course, people had the audacity to cast off our authority at times. But the idea is this
Yeah.
racialized Englishness, this pan global Englishness. And that's what's fed into modern racialized whiteness in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Canada and the USA. So the the very story of who the English were and where they came from absolutely directly feeds into modern
Yeah.
racialized politics. And that's why it's been such a heated topic in academic circles over the
Yeah.
last decade. And it's really important that we have these conversations. We accept that this has direct impact on marginalized people, of people of color. It has direct impact on our scholarship. The way we write
Mhm.
has a direct impact, and on the way politics work and society works today. The problem is, of course, these terms are widely used in a variety of different ways and often not as dog whistles. And that, going back to
Yeah.
my point, that for many people, it's just a story of who we are and where we came from. And this is the challenge we face is
Mhm.
not everyone, there's a game to be played of where and how we raise this issue, because for some
Yeah.
people you're racializing them and radicalizing them by chastising the very use of the term, when actually they had a very loose or poor understanding and would have been happy to listen to a bit more information that gave them a guidance about
Mhm.
what we know about this period and how it informs who we are today.
Yeah.
And in other cases we need to be absolutely robust because we're dealing with ideologues who are, trying to create an idea of a
Yeah.
white Britain, a xenophobic, anti-Islamic Britain that is very much about
Yeah.
saying we are Anglo-Saxon. We have a distinctive ethnic origin that excludes everyone that's come in the last 1,000 years. So they can
Mhm.
literally write out they're pre they're pre prep they're prepping
Yeah.
for genocide via the argumentation of purity of race and ethnicity. And
Yeah.
that's where we've got to be very careful.
Well, and so I think that's all very, very good points. And yeah, you're exactly right. It's all heavily racialized stuff that, you know, that well, all across where the British Empire once was,
Yeah.
they try to connect to. Of course, I'm most familiar with in the United States, but I have seen it also in, as you mentioned, Australia and Canada and New Zealand and
And it's, as usual, Dane, it's about context. If you're talking to a school group who haven't come across the term
yeah,
before, there's no
yeah,
point haranguing them about
yeah,
language and complicated narratives. But if you're trying to talk to and if you're dealing with ideologues online and say, "Oh, I'm Anglo-Saxon, I'm proud," then it's usually it's not difficult to work out you're dealing with people who are
yeah,
extremists and hateful, and there's no conversation to be had. But a lot of people in between need guidance on what we're talking about here, because it's
yeah,
directly informing immigration policy narratives in political discourse,
yeah,
narratives on language, ethnicity, skin, race, skin tone, race, colorism, all manner of different dimensions. And it plays out differently even with these islands. And that's the thing that I think international viewers need to be aware of. Um, Welsh, Scottish,
mhm,
pan-Celtic identities, Irish identities also play on these
yep,
ethnic ideas. So I was alerting my TikTok audience to the dog whistle that is actually more common, I find, than Anglo-Saxon
yeah,
or
yeah.
English, is Anglo-Celt. This
Oh,
idea that it's this bizarre idea that, well, it means of these islands and we're all together in the fight against the Johnny foreigner who wants to come here and is brown
yeah,
skinned. So it's kind of this weird, perverse mix up because, at one level, the story of early Britain is one of Celt versus Saxon in popular
mhm,
terms. But if you combine them together and say Anglo-Celt, it's just another way of saying white British and we don't like any foreigners with their curries and their their prayers and their weird ways, and it's just another way of being racist.
Yeah.
And so we've just got to be aware. We can't say everyone who uses the term Anglo-Celt is a racist, because most people will find this term and use it and not think about it. But it's about making people aware of
Mhm.
when and how these terms are weaponized. So I think
Exactly.
some of my colleagues just lose the plot on this point because they're so used to dealing with extremists. They forget that actually a lot of people either don't know, don't care, or are just ignorant and need a little bit of education.
Yeah.
And it's only the hardcore who want these terms to be radicalized. And we've got to be careful that we, like most people, just hear Vikings and they think Kirk Douglas, or they think the TV show Vikings. They
Yeah.
don't think, oh, look at all these complicated issues.
Yeah.
And so if you start shouting someone with a megaphone in the street, it's not Viking, you idiot, that's not going to help anyone. So it's
Yeah.
about trying to know when to fight the fights, know when to pitch the battles, know when to just dance around terms. I've had, if I'm on a train and someone says something mad about British history to me, what's the point in arguing, But then
Yeah.
maybe, but in a lecture room where it's my lecture, my class, my audience is my students, we definitely
Mhm.
have it out about these issues, So it's about working out when's the place to do it and
Yeah,
what's the,
exactly.
you know. No, that is, if there's some old geezer on the on a bus going, I don't understand. Everyone's a different gender these days. What's the point in arguing about it? You go, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But then if it is actually in a context where, oh no, we need to stand up on this issue. This is someone trying to peddle a particular narrative on a website or
Yeah.
a news forum. That then we have to pick our battles, pick our
Mhm.
moments. Is it worth
Yeah.
having the argument? I
Yeah,
always talk about the
exactly.
the comedy scenario where I was at a war memorial once, and
Oh yeah.
an old lady came up to me and said, "This is what it's all about, isn't it?" And I went, "Where's this going? What could that mean? This is what it's all about. What's that mean?" And I just went, "Yeah, yes, tragic loss of human life." I thought that was
Yeah.
the most neutral thing. And he, yeah, you know who I blame for all of this? And I thought, who could it be? It could either be the British government, it could be the people we're
Mhm.
fighting, or it could have been something else. He goes, that bloody Gary Lineker, who's a British football soccer player,
Yeah.
and turned TV presenter, who is
Mhm.
got slightly left of centre views, and therefore the right wing press hate him. And he's like, he's to
Mhm.
blame.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Sorry, there's an adorable 3-year-old
Oh,
walking in.
hello.
Yeah, he's wearing a dinosaur outfit and pretending he's there's a TV show in the US called on the Disney Channel called Dino Ranch, and he's pretending to ride one of the so which is funny, because you yourself dress up in that T-Rex get
Oh, I
up
did do that.
sometimes.
Yes.
Yeah. But yeah, but
I need to
yeah,
get a new one because I think the other ones are deflated now. I think they
yeah.
broke, but I
Yeah,
need to try them out
exactly.
again.
But yeah, but going back to your thing, yeah, I agree, and we need to pick our battles, because there are plenty of times where I'm just like, it's not worth arguing this out with somebody, and then there are other times where they're saying something so ignorant where I'm like, no, I
Yeah.
need to I need to hop on here and address them, and then I'll usually quickly block them afterwards because I don't
I think
want
that's the
to.
point. Is if
Yeah,
you, it's a horrible thing to say, but most of the time, if you're having to address them, there's no conversation to be had. And I get it wrong. Like this one guy left the most moronic comment, and I thought I'm not going to respond to that. And they come back a day later, and he's left another comment. I've looked it up now, and I realised I was wrong. Thanks. And he go, oh, you know, and
yeah,
I was just about to block him for being some psycho neo-Nazi, and actually he was just like, oh, I didn't know that, and I was like,
yeah,
oh man. And there was one comment, somebody recently where I said, they said something, and I just said question. I said sorry, and they sent me this essay length. I am so sorry. I got it completely wrong. I double checked, and you were totally right. It is Bronze Age or something. And I am
yeah,
so embarrassed that I didn't remember. And I was going, I just didn't know what you meant. I didn't even know that you in your head you'd say this whole, and it's just lovely that people are, and not everyone. Some people are
yeah,
there and they're disingenuous, but there's a lot of people who do care, who are understanding that yes, we're doing a little bit of performative pushback, and sometimes we're being quite, blunt about it.
yeah,
But most people get that it's a bit of a performance, and
yeah,
it's
exactly.
healthy. Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, yeah, well, how I usually do it is I'll give them time to see the comment and such. And if they come back with another ignorant comment or something like that, then I'll usually be like, all right, I'm done with you, and I'll block. Um because it's just And here's another argument I'll make. The way I see it is the comments that we make to those people, especially if they're in like actual comments and not DMs, is it's not for the people who have already made up their minds who are making those comments. It's for people who may see the comments from the ignorant people and may be swayed, but we have provided, you know, evidence to the contrary, and that may actually prevent them from going down that rabbit hole of bigotry and white supremacy and ignorance. So that's sort of how I look at it when I leave comments on my TikTok or YouTube videos, where it's like, well, here's this, and then if I have to, then I'll block them. So. I think that's and for me I think that's a good way I've looked at it is and of course there are other times where like I'll go ahead and delete because like on the video with Archaeosupermark a lot of the people their responses were just they were pretty much just saying, oh, you're soy boys or you're betas, and I'm just like, I'm not even gonna respond to this, and block 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 block, and I'm like that's not adding to the conversation at all. And then of course there were a couple of other people
I
who were
love that
like,
phrase. It's so
stupid
stupid.
it is.
What's
Well,
it
and then
even
yeah,
mean?
yeah.
Soy boy, because real men drink cow milk, because
I
that's
get it,
manly.
eat meat. I think it's like, a vegetarian thing or a vegan thing. I don't
Yeah,
know. I don't know. And
yeah.
again, it's just like, well, and then some were like, oh, you like you can hear their mothers calling them from the top of the basement, and like we're somehow, and I'm just like, like, and that's
That's,
I'm like, are we back in the 90s and 80s? Like I thought this is an irrelevant term at this point. Like pick a different insult
I
kind of
must
kind of
admit,
thing.
I don't bother even checking my blog. I vet all
Uh,
comments on
yeah,
everything but TikTok, and
yeah.
I must admit, I know this affects my interaction on YouTube, but I
You
haven't got the
probably,
energy. I haven't got.
you're probably better off not. To be
Uh,
honest, you're probably better off just sort of like ignoring them. You know.
I mean,
Uh,
every couple of weeks I check held comments. Let's see what we got. Oh, I have one held comment. An interesting video, thank you. With from on an old video. So, well, there you are. But most of the time, sometimes I get little flurries of I when I interviewed Tad Sturmer, I had he's
yeah,
a he's a traitor, or something,
yeah,
and it's all very angry. And I went, oh,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah, I've had that before where it's just sort of like, well, and then I had somebody actually from Europe try to say, because I was critical, because I wasn't even critical of Europe, but I was like, I had made a video about U.S. history, and they, for whatever reason, were like, "Oh, you should try being critical of, of the United States." I'm just like, that's a good chunk of my YouTube channel. Have you not seen my, like, I have an entire series currently that I have one more video left in it, but entire series currently talking about the
People
early U.S. imperial expansion of the United States, and it's all about the United States, genocide of the Native Americans and
they're
thing,
not even
and
listening beyond the
yeah,
accent. That's the thing is
yeah.
I genuinely understand people's frustration with Britain. I know
Yeah.
we're a pain and we're collectively a pain in the ass.
Well, and they're,
I,
yeah,
but you've got
yeah,
to actually call me a pain in the ass for what I actually say, not just because I'm British. That's the point.
yeah, yeah,
There's plenty of
exactly.
reasons to disagree with me without just going, oh,
Yeah, exactly.
you
Well,
know,
same with the United States, because like
yeah.
that. Well, like somebody from like Morocco left a comment was like typical first worlders, and I'm just like, and the thing is, they were leaving a comment about they were trying to correct me about the history of the United States. Actually, this happened in the United States, and how does a Moroccan know more than somebody from the U.S.? I'm just like, you don't. That's the point. It's my history, and I've provided my sources, and I thoroughly researched this. I'm not coming into your
No.
videos and trying to claim I know more about Moroccan history or North African history than so. And that also happens a lot of times with people in Europe. Is unfortunately people in Europe try to act like they know more about U.S. history than people in the U.S. know. And to be fair, sometimes they do, but one could argue the opposite. I've had conversations with people in Europe who clearly don't know their own history. For it's everywhere, and to try to act like the U.S. or Britain are the only ones who do that
Absolutely.
is a bit myopic, I would say.
It's a
So
blessing and a curse that we have the
yeah,
world in one
yeah.
place on the internet, you know.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Well, and and of course there are plenty of people across the world that aren't like that. That's also a way that we've helped. Like you said, blessing and curse, that we've come together and we're able to have these conversations to a large degree.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
But yeah. So unfortunately, the medieval period is just like a lot of periods, like the Wild West, which is part of why I'm doing my series on the early U.S. imperial expansion. Is heavily mythologized. Ancient Rome, Sparta. Sometimes, funnily enough, the samurai in Japan.
Oh
Because
yeah.
again, that's that machismo.
Yeah.
Manly ultimate warriors things. Cowboys, Vikings, but the medieval period is just one of those rife periods where it's like, oh, let's use this for whatever right wing propaganda white supremacist propaganda we can. Again, pointing to the to this day, pointing to this day to white supremacist groups who are using, oh, Knights of yada yada yada, Knights of the Golden Sword and Gun or whatever. Of course, I just made that up, but funnily enough, now I think about it, there's probably one out there that's not that far off from
That's the
that.
problem, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
you know, but and it's just well, and then we have to sort of finish up. We won't go in depth on that because that when people went in depth on that multiple years ago, when it happened. But we have people like the QAnon shaman who use,
Yes.
medieval tattoos and uh,
Yes.
simultaneously, to is white supremacist dog whistles,
Yeah.
simultaneously while also culturally appropriating Native American garb because despite what people said when he originally was there, oh, he's wearing a Viking helmet. I saw the picture. I'm like, no, that's not a Viking helmet. That's a buffalo headdress. That's a buffalo. It's something that's very common into the Great Plains people, and he's wearing. I presume I never really looked into it, but I presume his pants were like buffalo skin or something like that. And he was wearing sort of, Native American esque war paint, and so it's just like that's another example of how that's used and how, as we talked about a little bit earlier, how primitivism goes into that, the whole playing Indian. So
You've
so
you've
yeah.
you've ca captured that perfectly, Dane, and that was
Yeah.
actually a topic of a recent seminar I gave where
Yeah.
I tried to articulate that point, and you've just said exactly the right thing in my opinion, because but I've heard a lot of people misunderstand that, and it doesn't matter, it's just one weirdo, but it does matter
It
because
does. Yeah.
he became an icon of that event, and he became such an important talking point that a lot of damage was done
Hmm.
to Norse pagans, to indigenous people,
Hmm.
and to, you know, to democracy, more importantly. But
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
there's a mix of misinformation there that became heavily sensationalized, and I think yeah. So I've actually just presented about that topic. I'd love to, if I ever get to write something up, I'd love to send it to you. But I think that's really important. There's been a real weird silence about that in the medieval community since, because I think so many people screwed up on discussing
Mm.
that. At
Yeah.
least I haven't found. That's my sense of things. So I think there's a lot of lessons there about how we. It's very we're pressured to react quickly,
Hmm.
even as experts, to events that we may not fully appreciate the ramifications of what we say, and that's one of the challenges of social media, that we can't always get it right 100%, but we've got to own it and rectify if we go a little bit astray, even if everything we said was accurate, but it can be used in a particular way. We go, well, no, no, I'm not saying this, and so it's really, so I did a video about closed practices and someone who believes there's no such thing as closed practices.
Oh yeah,
And
yeah.
then
That's
someone rightly says, well, you're not trying to say that North paganism is a closed practice, are you? Or Christianity is white, a white European closed practice. No, 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 of course
no.
not. I'm talking about, but it's amazing how, whether by intention or accident, people get the wrong end of the stick. So it's really important we stay with these and clarify what we're saying, so people can't
Yeah,
run off with these
yeah.
ideas.
Well, and it's funny. What always is funny to me about when people try to culturally appropriate Native American practices is if you talk to a lot of times if you talk to Native American nations and actually get their permission. Now they won't give you permission to use their most sacred rites, but they will show you appropriate you know ceremonial things or other practices that with it from the culture that you can use. I have on my bookshelf a couple of books written by people, citizens of the Eastern Band of the Cherokee in North Carolina, which is a federally recognized Cherokee nation, where they're like, here are rituals that you can incorporate into your life from our culture under the caveat that we're not giving you our most sacred
Yeah,
rituals that you can't use. And
yeah. Well,
so
this is the
if they would just actually or like in the case of like Siberian shamanism from Mongolia and Central Europe and such. There's somebody who wrote a book on that recently where he made that caveat where he's like, look, I've lived with these people, I learned the proper rites, and here are rites that you can incorporate into your life that are again not their most sacred rituals. These are
there's
rituals
so many.
that you have that I've been given explicit permission to give to you, and the other things I don't have permission to give to you because it is and I
It's
think
a
that's
really good point.
yeah,
That's a really good point, and I find that while looking on, I I
yeah,
I see so there's so little
yeah,
that people are trying to defend. It's not as if people are trying to bracket off large parts of modern life as
no,
indigenous, like the use of electric lights at night and
no,
using pencils or something like. All they're
yeah,
saying is there's some really specific
yeah.
materials
Well, like yeah, well,
which you
like
need just not, and they
yeah,
can't because people go. It's like people just are desperate to say certain words that begin with a
yeah,
particular letter. But why can't I? But no, why would you want to? Where are
yeah,
you ever going to use that? That's not offensive. But I might want to say it in a
mm,
context. What context do you want to? They
yeah,
just it's just like people are itching to say it. They just want to. If you gave them free, like, I want to give you a permit. You're going to say this. You can shout it in this booth. Well, I don't want to shout it in that booth.
yeah,
Oh, yeah, you want people to hear it then, do you? Like
yeah,
you don't want to just have some
exactly.
sage and whatever, do some rich,
Yeah,
no one will see it. Oh no, but I want an audience. I want an
yeah,
audience knowing that I did it because it's my right to do it. It's weird. It's
yeah. It's
entitled. It's
weird. Yeah,
dickish.
yeah. It's incredibly weird. Well, and that's talking about sage. On TikTok, I follow a couple of Native American creators from the Southwest, the American Southwest, where white sage is sacred to, and that's
That's
something
what I
that
meant. White sage. Yeah. So yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. But that's something they say. They said is they're like, hey, you can use white sage if you get it from a Native American, buyer, if you get it ethically from somebody of that culture, they're like, that's what, and of course they don't want that. They want just mine, mine, mine. And I think that
Yeah.
again goes to back to sort of round it back off, for the end that goes back again to the medieval period where it's like, oh, we want these particular pieces of the medieval period for our white supremacist rhetoric. It's mine, mine, mine. We don't want the nuance. We want
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and that's something we see both in the U.S. and in, as you brought up, in the Europe and Britain and such. So yeah. So with that, thank you for coming on, Howard. Always good to have you on. Like a
Thank you
lot of
so
good
much for letting me
insight.
come on.
Yeah,
Great.
yeah, a lot of good insight. And such. And you know what? Maybe because you're also a mortuary archaeologist. Maybe in October, can have you on for like Halloween related something or another.
Okay. Yeah, we can do
Maybe you
some
can
deathly stuff.
maybe
Yeah,
you can do a more accurate vampire, undead thing
let's do some
than
undead stuff.
Milo. Yes. Yes, because yeah.
Yeah, I got a bit angry about that. Yeah, but I'm sorry about that. But
No, no, I understand.
I just
Well,
got it into my bee
well,
in my bonnet
well, and
about it.
and
But
and 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 to be fair, I didn't explain my point that very well either. So that's
no, it's all good.
yeah.
It's all part of
But
the
but
fun.
yeah, but
We
yeah,
care about these issues, and
yeah.
it's just yeah.
But you could come on and you could talk about that. I think that
I'd
would
love
be a
to.
good thing.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
But yeah, so yeah, thank you for coming on, and everyone else. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to this video on my YouTube channel, Archeo Viking. Like, share, and subscribe to Howard Williams, Archaeodeath on pretty much every social media, Instagram, TikTok, etc. And YouTube. He does have a YouTube channel that he puts his guest lectures and such on. So give that a subscribe. And if y'all want to see us talk about any other issues related to either this subject or other archaeology subjects, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And remember, again, to like, share, and subscribe. And I hope you all have a good day. And again, Howard, thank you for coming on.